You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Thursday, July 1st, 2021. Now, all week we have been talking about two great saints from the early church, Saints Peter and Paul, who we celebrate their death this week. They died in the year 67 under the insane Roman Emperor Nero. We also talked yesterday about the first martyrs in Rome who were also killed in this time period when Nero burned down the city and blamed it on them. Now, we've talked a lot about St. Peter, about his life, his conversion, and also the work that he did in the early church. Now, we're going to spend the next 2 days talking about St. Paul. Now, St. Paul had a very different life than St. Peter, and he also came to know Jesus in a very different way. We don't meet St. Paul at all in the Gospels. In fact, we have no reason to believe that he ever actually encountered Jesus while Jesus was alive. Instead, we begin to hear about St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, and we hear that his name is actually Saul. He is a Pharisee, which means that he is very well versed on the Jewish faith, that he has studied it, and also that he is meticulous about following the rules. If you remember from what Jesus says to the Pharisees in the gospel, he talks to them often about how they are so obsessed with the rules, but they do not have a heart of faith. The rules to them are more important than anything. So that is Paul. Now, Paul is very active in the work of persecuting the early church. In fact, we hear that he is present when St. Stephen is martyred, when he is stoned to death. And he also takes on the job of rounding up Christians. In fact, he sets out for the city of Damascus, determined to go there to find the Christians and to return to Jerusalem with them in chains. This is his quest. However, on the road to Damascus, something incredible happens. He is riding his horse when suddenly there is a blinding light. He falls from his horse and he sees a vision of Jesus. And Jesus says to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" Of course, Paul is dumbstruck. He doesn't know who this is. He is blind after this. His companions have to take him to a house where he lays sick in bed for days. And then Christ appears to one of his followers in Damascus, tells him to go to Paul to pray with him. And when he does, scales fall from Paul's eyes. He believes that the man he met along the road to Damascus is Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. He asks to be baptized immediately. And from that moment forward, he is a devout Christian, determined to do Jesus' work. And he spends the rest of his life doing that. He travels through all of the known world, oftentimes against terrible persecution. He ends up in jail for 2 years in Spain. Then he is shipwrecked. Then he goes to Rome and he is in jail there for 2 years, only to be freed and then thrown back in jail. And we know that this all happens during the persecution when the insane Emperor Nero has blamed a fire in the city in Rome on the Christians. Eventually, Paul and Peter are sentenced to death. However, they receive very different deaths. Because of who his father was, St. Paul was actually a Roman citizen. And as a citizen of Rome, he had certain rights. For example, he couldn't be beaten or killed in certain ways. So since he was a Roman citizen, he was given a quick and painless death. He was taken outside the city gates and he was quickly beheaded. Unlike St. Peter, who was crucified, which would have been a very slow and painful death. But nonetheless, he gave his life, he offered his death out of love for Jesus. Now, one thing to remember about St. Paul is that he is probably the most important writer in all of human history. After St. Paul would travel the world and establish churches in all of these cities, he stayed in touch with them. He wrote letters to them. This is why we have letters from St. Paul at the very end of the Bible. He wrote letters to his church in Rome, to his church to the Philippians, to the Galatians, all of these groups of people he wrote letters to continue to guide and inspire them. Also, we have the words from the consecration in the Mass recorded by St. Paul, the very words that the priest still says today. When acting in the person of Christ, he changes ordinary bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Because of this, many scholars believe that Paul himself was a priest, that he said Holy Mass, and that when he went to a new place, he laid hands on other men, brought them into the priesthood and trained them so that once he left, the church could celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass there as well. St. Paul is an incredibly important figure in the church, and he reminds us to continually be seeking God, to be wrestling with those faith questions, and to be evangelizing the world, to not be afraid, even if prison or pain or shipwreck is a possibility, that we should continue to preach Jesus's good name and bring people into the faith. And so, Sprouts, my challenge for you today is to find a Bible and to flip to the back and to find the letters of St. Paul. There are many of them: Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, and more. Find them and read even just a couple verses written by St. Paul, this man who was persecuting the faith but became the greatest evangelist our church has ever known. That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God created you to be. Just one more thing. We would like to encourage you to set up a prayer space in your home. We have a new guide to help you do this, which is packed full of pictures of other families' prayer spaces, real ones from people living in apartments and little houses and all sorts of other situations, to inspire you to believe that no matter who you are, what house you live in, there is space for prayer. Visit the show notes for the direct link to download the guide.
This show is a production of the Spoke Street Media Podcast Network. For more great podcasts, visit spokestreet.com.